As I said, I'm Deb Ollis. I'm a senior lecturer at Deakin University, and I've worked in the area of sexuality education for the past probably 30 years now, first as a teacher, of course, and then moving through the systems, and now I'm in a university setting. So I've called my paper presentation, Respectful Relationships, Same, but Different, because I guess what I want to do to start with is contextualise the respectful relationships work I've been doing in Victoria historically, because for me I've come back to this area after 20 years to find that very little has changed. Then I would like to just present the case study that I've been involved in Victoria that Emma talked about, and then maybe just using young people's voices and the findings from work that I've been doing with teachers about maybe how do we prevent what I've called Groundhog Day, and in 20 years from now saying, why is it that nothing's different? But as a result of coming back to the work, I found a newspaper file that I'd had for 20 years, and I was just going through the articles, and I found this quote in the Age newspaper in Victoria by Kevin Childs in 1991, where he said, in spite of the efforts by churches, educators and legislators and the gains made by the women's movement over the past 20 years, sexist and discriminatory attitudes towards women still proliferate and violent behaviours continues to be reinforced. Power differences and inequalities that characterise relationships between men and women. Now, if we're thinking about what he was saying 20 years ago, that's 40 years ago, and those relationships and challenges remain today. So 20 years ago, I became involved in this area. Again, there was Commonwealth money provided for the national school-based project called Gender and Violence Project. I was involved in the development of a position paper after consultation across the country. Now, I'm sure there's people here who are involved in those consultations. And what that found was that what schools were doing at that time was that their programs were based on understandings around individual pathology, essentialism, that socialisation and that sort of liberal feminist notion of sort of roles. If we just teach kids new roles, they'll be able to act in non-violent ways. And there was beginning to be some work around gender construction, some work around looking at issues around masculinities and femininities. Now, out of that position paper came the development of a whole school kit to gender-based violence, which was called No Fear. It was distributed nationally, and states and territories did professional development. Now, the key underlying framework in both the position paper and those materials was about gender and power. We needed to address these issues in the context of gender and power. We needed to look at masculinities and femininities and the construction of gender. Now, that was recommended 20 years ago. So it was amazing for me to come back now and find that the current literature, the programs that are being developed really in a similar framework. But the present is, and I'll come to that in a minute, and I think what both Amanda and Martin have demonstrated is that very little has changed in terms of the nature and extent of violence. It is still overwhelmingly perpetuated by men against women, children and other men. And we heard the statistics that Amanda presented to us about what it costs both the community and men and women. The problem is still poorly understood in schools. The definition is still very narrow, even though we've had those sorts of resources available to schools for the past 20 years. Teachers are reluctant and afraid to address it in the classroom, and not surprisingly, because of the sorts of issues we've heard this morning, if they haven't had teacher training, if they're dealing with their own issues, and if schools aren't supportive. It's not surprising that they are reluctant to do it. As I said, little has changed, I believe, in the approach, except for the notion of advocating respect up front. So we started to talk about respectful relationships as the platform. But I wonder, by using that platform, are we just masking, making it easier for people, making it more palatable to address gender-based violence? We're sort of hiding it underneath this notion of respectful relationships because people find that a bit easier to deal with. And I'm going to sort of show you with the work that I've been doing in Victoria that for the male teachers involved in the study that I've been involved in, that was actually the case. So I'm using the gender-based violence demonstration project as a case study to illustrate some of these points. Again, this project has come out of a concern about the extent of gender-based violence in our community. And what do we do in this context? Schools will fix it. We know schools will fix it. We'll just give them something else to do. It is based, as Emma said, on a broad review of the area. Go back one. This report here by Michael Flood and his colleagues at Vic Health. It is the actual project is a whole school approach. The model that was developed, it hasn't been released yet, hence you are not able to actually see the model. But there is a model inherent in that Casa House have developed that shows the connection between these areas. What I'm talking about today is the part that I was involved with, and that is the curriculum material. But it does involve all of those elements. It includes a teaching resource that focuses specifically on gender, power and violence and building respectful relationships. The classroom materials that I'm going to talk about were trialled with Year 8s and 9 students in 4 secondary schools in very low SES areas. The schools were identified by the Department of Education and targeted for, they felt they were schools that could benefit from the use of the materials. I collected data from students and teachers. I had ethics to do that under the guide of updating the materials once they'd been trialled. And the data was collected between August and December. So you can see from this slide how many teachers were involved, what was involved in that data collection. So it just gives you a sense there were of the way that I've developed, they presented the data. And what I'm going to present today very much comes from the focus groups with teachers and students. Just to give you a broad overview of the curriculum, I've just presented the titles here. Basically, the Year 8 component is purely looking at gender. It looks at gender and power, and it looks at gender. The only issue, specific issue around gender-based violence is the issue of sexual harassment. It is more about exploring the sorts of issues that Martin talked about around masculinities and femininities, looking at gender, looking at relationships, respect, those sorts of things. The second unit is very much focused on, it's called the Power Connection, on looking at the issue of gender and power. Marie and Dave's work has also been woven through it in an attempt to try and address some of the issues that are being raised. Also, the wheel has not been reinvented. Activities in that are drawn from a range of resources that have been addressing these issues, and new material has been written as well. Okay, so the key themes from the teachers. The subject context impacted on the perceived success from the teachers. So teachers who had a health education and sexuality education background were very comfortable with it. In a pastoral care context or that sort of program, it was very successful. There was one school who trialled it in an English context, and it was that the teachers really found that very challenging to do it in that context. What was interesting, that experienced teachers, yet teachers who hadn't taught in this area before, found the experience of teaching these sorts of issues extremely positive. They talked about how the relationships between them and the students had been improved, and issues like the students had me for science and maths, and to begin with they said, how can you be teaching this stuff? and the teachers saying exactly the same thing. But both the students and the teachers talked about how it was building relationships between them because of the types of pedagogies they were using as well. It changed the pedagogies for these particular teachers who weren't used to doing active pedagogies where kids were getting up, moving around, where kids were doing a lot of inquiry-based learning, where they were doing lots of discussion and small group work. So the teachers talked a lot about what a positive impact that had on their own teaching. And as you'll see from the kids, it really improved the kids' engagement. Kids who would normally be quite disengaged wanted to go to health. They didn't want to miss out on what was going on. Male teachers, when I was running the focus groups, the majority of them wanted a broader focus on violence rather than violence against women. They wanted a greater focus on male-to-male violence as distinct from homophobic violence. So they talked about that, and I'll show you some of the illustrations of that. The key themes from the kids, they found it really relevant. That really raised their awareness, where they talked about things like, I didn't realise the extent of it. You know, they talked about how important it was. Interestingly, they were, after doing the program, able to articulate an understanding of gender-based violence beyond the physical. So they started with their understanding of violence coming from the physical. Now, as I'll show you a couple of illustrations, they were able to articulate issues like fear, for example. So that was really positive. Power was missing in the kids' analysis of what they'd done. Now, that was really interesting considering there was so much power in it. So that's a real learning for us, I think. The active pedagogies really improved participation, enjoyment, and there was little resistance from the boys, yet the resistance was perceived from the male teachers. That was interesting. So let's have a few examples from the students. So, Max, you know, what is gender-based violence? I'm trying to think. It's sort of like there could be verbal abuse and physical abuse, and being stuck in a relationship you're too scared to get out of. So that was sort of characteristic of, you know, a much greater level of sophistication. What do you understand by gender as a female? It's good to think that they're teaching us that we're all equal and that it's not just the boys doing sexual abuse and we all have our own problems, but it's not just the girl-boy group now, it's basically the group beyond girls and boys. And I thought that was extremely significant because it's that notion that there is not just, you know, a binaries are necessarily around, you know, male and female. It's beyond that, and I thought that was really interesting. And then you've got the boy down here talking about, you know, the traditional notions of masculinities. Boys keep thinking to be masculine, they don't have to talk about their feelings. They don't want to feel like they're a girl and get teased about expressing their feelings. Very consistent with the sort of data that are being presented. Now this is understanding causes of violence. Now this is a really interesting dialogue. I know it's a bit long, but it's, I'm asking, what do you think causes gender-based violence? Tom, different experiences this person had in life. They could have been abused as a child sort of thing. What else do you think causes gender-based violence? Alcohol and stuff? Opinions on different subjects, drugs, alcohol, all sorts of things, I guess. Anything else? Past experiences. Anything else? We were looking at cases where people got locked in their basement and stuff like, and not allowed to leave and too scared to leave the relationship, which is pretty scary considering people do that. Emily, what happens between, say, two people? So what's at the core of that situation? Better to talk about things and don't be scared to talk to friends and family. Emily, possibly could help with the problem. What's happening in the relationship between the two people? It's not really steady, lots of conflict, no communication, misunderstanding leads to other things. Amber, some fault, the lights go on and off and the noise goes out. It's a bit scary. No mention of power. No mention of inequality. You know, so that's what I was trying to see if I could bring out. Well, what else? But it just wouldn't come. Now, considering that was a key aim of the materials, that didn't happen. This is about hiding the gender-based violence under respectful relationships. This is one of the male teachers. It's also worked a little better for me since I've started calling it respectful relationships. I know that sounds pedantic, but when I went with that gender and violence, you could see, it did seem to alienate a few kids. They just looked at you strangely like, what are we doing here? But as soon as it's respectful, as it's been for the last 4 weeks, it's changed, I think. Honestly, there were female staff when they went through the PD, they were really quite put off by the whole thing. That's probably the same for some kids that are sitting in class that are like this when you walk in and you say that. We say that we think that respectful relationships is a good name for it. So the reality. So this is the reality. This is, I had this particular naughty boy that I had to, I'm student management, so I had to pull him out of Kylie's class to talk to him about something. And I said, right, you're going to have to do this and now. And he said, oh, but can I go back into my health class first? So he was really keen to go back. So that was a really good thing to hear. So of course I let him go. So this was one of those naughty boys who played up, that sort of student that Martin talked about that he didn't want to be there. But he wanted to go back. He didn't want to miss out on this class. Another female teacher, yeah. I had the all-boys class at the start and I thought, oh my God, here we go. But they were together. They were a good class and they were fun and they were naughty at the same time. But when you go through these things, obviously things like pornography come up, and depending on how they approach you, you allow the conversation to go on and then it's okay, cross the boundary lines, and of course I have to stop it. But overall the boys were really, really good. I couldn't say a bad word. And the final female teacher, they were okay. They could see that it was a sort of a structural problem, that it wasn't the individual's fault. You know how sometimes, what I really try hard to make sure that it's not to blame the boys, if you know what I mean. So that was okay. They were, well, what about the boys? And obviously they made a point that, yeah, actually, obviously, it can happen with boys and men as well. So you need to be aware of that. So they came up with a few awareness comments but I think they got the gist of what it was about as well, and they were aware of the problem. They were aware of some of the statistics, even though they didn't know them exactly. So I don't think they took it personally. So you can see the reality was that the boys were actually really engaged in it. They saw it, the structural nature of it. So the future. So how do we build, how do we avoid in 20 years' time somebody putting up some of our research to say, look, they've been doing it now for 40 years and nothing's changed. Obviously we have to build on the past. I don't know what happened to, all those no-fear materials, but something about the approach that we take where we've got kids and we put a kid into school, it doesn't work. We've got to find another way to embed this material into our more general approaches in schools. We still need to be explicit about gender and power, and as Dunn and her colleagues say, there is therefore a need to explore and categorise the manifestations within an explicit gender framework. Without this, it will be impossible to identify effective system-wide strategies to address it. I don't think respectful relationships is really important, but we have to be explicit that it's about violence against women, about gender-based violence, about violence against men, in relation to homophobia. We do need to keep that framework explicit. And we need to listen to the students. And this is what the students said. We need to talk about it. Talk about it more, yeah, because it's the sort of thing, if you don't know about it, it's sort of scary. Whereas people who get called gays and stuff like that, it's all blown out of proportion way too easily because we don't have a greater understanding of it. Or Amber, I think we need to do a course or something on it just to get people's confidence up to be able to talk about that sort of thing. It constantly came through how much the kids loved the discussion. They loved to talk about it. Build empathy. As Grace says, I think this was better than normal curriculum because I think people understood more of what people actually feel. And Jess, especially because you get to see what other people think, how their opinions are different to yours and things like that. Develop understanding. And Jess says again, I was amazed by the fact that my feelings on the situation dramatically changed once I heard Peter's point of view. And that's a case study that comes from Casa House, and it's a classic, the two different perspectives around a situation of sexual assault. Raise awareness. It's very important that students are aware of what can happen in relations and what is right in relationships. Get students to see what gender-based violence can do. Jamie. It raised awareness over some of the sensitive topics we otherwise couldn't discuss. It was fun and I enjoyed it, as well as learned heaps from it. the importance of active learning strategies, informative and even a bit of fun. I enjoyed how the activities get you involved and up and around the classroom. You learn more. And that was another theme that kept coming through in the kids. You learn more by doing. You learn more. You learn more. It stays there. Reflection. And this is Bethany. The almost weekly reflections were a hassle. They made you think about what you've done. So it's that, you know, the kids having to write. And I think the really important one is the last one, the teacher. Jay is a very good, organised and a wise teacher to teach this subject topic. She knows what she's talking about. I thought that was actually really important. You know, the teacher is absolutely crucial in all this. And then just, I guess, you know, I was going through a couple of transcripts over the last couple of days looking, well, what are the challenges of working with boys identified from the teachers involved in this project? And a number of the teachers said getting to the boys who need it. So if we're thinking about the sorts of masculinities that Martin presented before, you know, making sure it's the boys that actually need to be exploring these issues. The performance issues was a really big one that teachers identified. You know, and these are some of the things teachers were saying, like, get rid of the stupid factor, the smart comments. What they say and what they think are two different things. And that came out a couple of times from the teachers where, you know, those performance issues in class where, you know, they were making homophobic or sexist comments. When you had the kids on their own doing the sort of work that Martin was doing and interviewing kids, they would say quite different things. Boys can bring out the worst in boys. Boys are about image and performing with their peers. In the schools, there were over the 4 schools, there were 5 all-boy classes. So it was actually in different contexts. One was only just a class of 11 and they were the really difficult boys. So they'd been put sort of in this small class. Understanding rights and responsibilities. And the teacher said they just didn't get it. It had to be worked on. And that came from the girls as well as the boys. They said the kids had real issues, really coming to terms with this notion of rights and responsibilities in relationships. And so I thought that was something that we really need to look at. Having appropriate activities, time and context. And a number of the teachers were teaching in these, like a pastoral care context. One was a thing called focus groups, and they had very little time. So what they started to do, they started to run it in their humanities or in their science classes because the kids were so engaged, they wanted to keep working on it. And as I said, one of the teachers says, it's been a long haul, but that the change was starting. And the teacher was saying it needs to be fairly loose. You need to be able to move with the kids. So if you've got these group of 11 boys who don't normally talk and you've got them talking about issues, then you need to be able to continue that process. Let the kids set the direction. And discussion, you know, overwhelmingly the kids and the teachers talked about how much the kids wanted to talk. The bell would go and they didn't want to go. I haven't had my turn, miss. You know, so they talked about how important that was. And so as educators of teachers, we need to make sure, or workers or whatever, we need to make sure that they know how to lead a discussion because there is skill in that as well. And, you know, of course, you know, one of the issues they identified was dealing with homophobic and sexist language. And one of the teachers talked about how the kids just could not see the problem with using the word slut. But we don't mean it's, you know, it's like, you know, gay, the same thing. But we don't mean it like that. We're just, you know, g'day slut, you know. So that was a real issue. And it's interesting, isn't it today the slut walks are on? Yes, it is. So it's interesting in terms of that notion of language and, you know, the reclaiming of some language. But anyway, I'll leave you there.